Are you in a toxic relationship in your church? Or maybe are you in denial that you are in a toxic relationship in your church? You see, I think sometimes we are naive to think that the ministry of the church is a safe place and that it's immune to the dysfunctions of the outside world. But here's the reality, and I think we know this, but let's remind ourselves the church is still made up of people. People are imperfect and we fail each other. And I think sometimes we are blinded by what is actually going on around us. And so I wanted to share in today's episode 5 key things to be looking for that could mean that you are in a spiritually abusive relationship. Thanks for joining me on the Curtis Biswell Show, where my vision is to cultivate a thriving community where worshipers are raised in character, competence, and cognitive health, empowering local churches to flourish. A little bit before we dive in today, because honestly, if I'm being completely truthful, I have put this episode off for a long time because it's pretty vulnerable for me. And it's, I think, a hot topic in and of our church society. I could go down the list. And if you're in the news or you get alerts on Google, you've seen pastor after pastor fail, people coming forth from their big churches and big ministries saying, I was abused, whether that was mentally or verbally or physically, by fill in the blank. So this happens, but yet people can get very opinionated about it. They can get also, it's very triggering for some. I felt like this needed to be talked about because I think this can be helpful. Before I share any of my story in the context and before I share the 5 indicators that you could be in an abusive relationship, can I just be the one? If you have suffered from any of these that I'm going to share today, if you've been in an abusive spiritual relationship, and maybe you are like, I don't think I ever want to work at a church again, can I just be the one to say, on behalf of the person that hurt you, I am so sorry. There's nothing that I can say or do that will take away that hurt. And I want you to know that the hurt and the pain that you experienced, number one, do not compare that with others. Do not. Do your best to not do that, because pain is pain. And we have a tendency to measure our pain. Well, okay, I didn't lose my wife like he did. So my thing that I'm walking through, I probably shouldn't even share that to him because it's not on the same level. Stop it. Your pain is your pain, and it has done something in you that you will have to be healed from. And I can't tell you how long that will take. I can't tell you all the things you need to do in order to receive that healing. But what has to come first is this apology from the person that should have apologized to you and didn't. I'm sorry that you went through that. And I pray that the Good Shepherd will reveal himself to you in ways you've never experienced, because he feels your pain. He cries with you. He hurts with you. So please take heart that I am sorry for what happened to you. Before I get to the 5 identifiers of potential spiritual abuse, I think I need to give you a little bit of context. Context is king, as one of my professors used to say. And so let me give you some surrounding. I'll try to keep it somewhat brief because my full story would take a long time. But I went to Bible college and I studied music ministry. While I was in Bible college, I felt God place the call on my heart to pursue music ministry. Okay. Music had always been a part of my life, but I hadn't decided or hadn't really thought of pursuing worship ministry, music ministry in the local church. So when I accepted that call on my life and I started training and getting experience, and then it led to my first church where I was green and I got my feet wet, I cut my teeth in ministry. In those few years, God placed another call on my life, and he placed this call on my life that, and actually a promise that one day you will serve in full-time music ministry. Now, again, little context to that, the denomination I grew up in and I was studying for, really, or studying through, there were no full-time worship leaders, let alone even full-time pastors. And so I want to share that because that created a little bit of angst and guilt in me. Like, okay, here's what my heart is saying, and here's what God is placing in me, but yet I feel guilty to pursue that since that's not a part of my context. That is kind of the backstory. So I was at that church for about 7 years, grew a lot, but I was very bivocational. And so again, there was a little bit of that tension. God, you called me to full time ministry, but when will that happen? Like in the church that I was at, there was no foreseeable timetable of that ever happening because we were just so small. We didn't have a lot of resources. But yet I served the best I could, and I served with a willing heart and grew a lot. And I believe those were very transformative years of my life. But enter in the promise, okay? So God calls me and my wife the end of 2012. All right, it's time to pursue full-time ministry. That call that I placed on your life, that desire I placed in your heart, that thing that you feel guilty about, it's time to take that next step. It was a bittersweet moment. We left family and friends of that church of about 7 years. We took that step. Okay, where is it, God? Where are we supposed to go? And that kind of turned into about a year of wondering. Okay, God, did we hear you right? Okay, and I'm sharing you all this story because the context really provides some clarity to the story, and maybe your story relates somewhat with this. Then we land at another church here in town and end up just sitting there and just serving, gaining relationships. There's a lot that we fell in love with. But there was no promise of a job. Okay. Keep in mind, I'm trying to pursue God's call in my life. So, fast forward, they end up needing a full time worship leader. And they say, "Are you interested?" I said, "Well, yes. Like, this is what I feel called of the Lord. This is what I've been searching after and praying for." And so, February of 2014, I feel like my promise was fulfilled of the Lord, full time ministry. Like, and I kind of was like pinching myself, like, God, is this for real? Like, and I felt guilty still. Okay. Like getting to do what I love full time as a job, which that's tricky in and of itself when you mix job and calling, because they don't always go hand in hand. But when you do mix them, it can become confusing at times if I'm being honest. But I share all that to say, like, that was the dream fulfilled. And I even grew more because there was more things to oversee, a bigger team to shepherd and pastor, more resources to help me do the jobs well. Um, and so, like, I grew a lot. But again, context of this story is crucial for what we're going to talk about today. I came in to a co-led pastoral led church. Okay. That's redundant. Two friends had planted the church together, and they both were dynamic personalities and they both were opposite, which can be good, because I think their strengths balanced each other out. One was very apostolic and evangelistic, very vision casting, lead the charge, very assertive in how he spoke, and also like got people on board. He rallied the troops, was great at getting people on board and being persuasive. Um, the other one was more of the shepherd teacher personality. Just didn't seem like he met a stranger. Um, Like it was easy to feel like you were his best friend. And again, I'm not elevating one or the other. I'm giving you perspective here. But at the end of the day, both were pretty strong personalities with different giftings, and it worked well for a while. Fast forward a few years, it started to pose conflict and friction. Now, keep in mind, I feel like I'm right in the middle. I'm the worship leader at the main church. We have these two co pastors. At that time, we had 2 or 3 campuses, but I feel caught in the middle because gifting wise, I'm somewhere in between those two. And um, unfortunately, you would have people in the church starting to prefer one or the other of these pastors, which is not healthy. And it's really not good at all. But then that leads to insecurity. Okay, the one pastor, people would come up to him and said, "I wish you preached more like so and so." Well, that's not helpful. That's not unifying the body. That's but that leads to insecurity, um, and probably resentment. And I think it fed that conflict between the two. Now, on top of that, you enter in the pastor who is a teacher shepherd personality. His wife gets diagnosed with cancer, and they start walking through that horrible journey. She ends up losing that battle with cancer. But I share all this to say because then you have that going on, like that inner turmoil that's not helping the whole conflict going on. Again, I'm feeling caught in the middle. It ends up being where it gets so bad between the two pastors where um, the one was probably going to get fired, but God called him to another ministry out of the state. And so he leaves. And keep in mind something I didn't share either. This pastor was the spearhead of the discipleship ministry. It was kind of his brainchild. He had developed this discipling ministry, and that's starting to take off at the church and become like the church pretty much everything it does points to that discipling ministry. But in the midst of that discipling ministry starts to be elevated pretty high. And again, I'm in the middle here. I start to observe some things. I'm like, okay, and I don't know if I fully think that that's completely right. And I don't have time to get into all the details because I'm not even to my 5 indicators yet. I'm still painting the picture here. So when that pastor leaves, there's big shoes to fill. And I feel this pressure to fill some of those shoes, even though I know I can't. You know, the visionary, the apostolic evangelist is still leading the charge, but yet, honestly, people do drain him. And he admits that. Like, he's not wired as a shepherd. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I felt a little bit wired that way, and people start kind of looking to me as one of the pastors, and I start, um, being there for the people that, let's just be honest, there are some of these people that they take a lot of energy, and it seems like other people in the church don't know what to do with them. So enter Curtis, and they're gravitated towards Curtis, and I felt like I pastored those people well. But then, based on all the hurt that had happened between the two friends that were co-pastors, because again, context is king, the lead pastor is now extra guarded because of what just went down a year or two ago. So I definitely was not always the support that he needed. And so part of this painting the picture was there was things that I didn't do right. Well, I didn't handle right. I became too cynical and critical at times and maybe asked too many questions. I don't think it's wrong to ask questions, but maybe even how I asked them wasn't the right posture. So this pastor is more guarded. I am not giving him what he needs. And so now we are in conflict. and or the writing is on the wall. Without going into too much detail, I was asked to leave at March of 2021. So now let's get to some indicators here because, again, trying to paint the picture that there's a lot of things that are at play. So, what I'm about to share are things to be on the lookout for. But there's always more, or there could be always more to the story than maybe what meets the eye. And so that's why I gave full perspective, because as time goes on, you can start to see more and more of the story and of people's stories. I will say it doesn't excuse when people still react in ways that they shouldn't, myself included, but it tells more of the complete story. Before we go on, here's what I would ask of you. Could you just take a moment and like and subscribe to this video so you could stay up to date on some of the things I'm putting out? My heart is to really be a resource for local churches, pastors, and worship leaders, and to help them grow, like I said at the beginning, in character, competence, and cognitive health. Here are some things to be identifying, looking out for, that could be indicators that you are in a spiritual abusive relationship. Indicator number one, in no particular order, but is spiritualization. So, what do I mean by that? Because you say, well, shouldn't we spiritualize things? I mean, scripture and those things are important, right? But what I mean by spiritualization is scripture is placed maybe even higher than Jesus. Things like this is things that played out for me. Hey, it's okay if God is calling you away, because um, that's a part of who God is. He's calling us to other ministries, and like we'll send you out. Well, like it's not a bad thing. But placing this spiritual twist on certain things, and it's kind of subtle, and sometimes in the moment you don't even realize it. But that is one of the indicators that you could be in a spiritually abusive relationship. Or like this one too. Hey, we're sending you out. Like, we're blessing you out. And in fact, when I was asked to leave, there was not much said to the church about it. In fact, the Sunday before my last Sunday was the Sunday they announced that I would be leaving. And it kind of left a lot of people confused and like, well, what just happened? Like, is there more to the story? And then people start talking and they start speculating, like, okay, well, there must have been something really bad that happened or immoral that happened. But some of that, what was spun, the narrative was, hey, God's just calling him out, like him and his wife too. Like, I think they're supposed to lead in other ministries, and so we're sending them out. So that's an over spiritualization that is not right. And that is an indicator of spiritual abuse. Point number two to be aware of, or indicator number two, is gaslighting. So you've probably heard this term thrown around quite a bit. And so let's kind of look at, what does that actually mean? Well, gaslighting is a psychological manipulation that makes the recipient question their feelings or their instincts and even their sanity. Gaslighting has kind of this emphasis on what you are doing wrong leads to you thinking, well, maybe I am the problem. Man, this was so prevalent to my situation. And honestly, I was blinded by it in the moment. Like, I was left time after time thinking, well, man, like coming out of a meeting of kind of reprimand, pointing out performance reviews and pointing out all the things that I'm doing wrong. And if you just let me work with you, we could really like create more influence for you. Like, those things would lead me walking out of those meetings like, man, maybe I'm the problem here. Maybe I'm just too sensitive, or maybe I'm too dramatic, and I'm blowing things out of proportion. Indicator number three is minimization. So how this played out for me was we talked a lot about at our church that we should not be led by our feelings, that we should be led by the authority of the truth of God's word. And I heard it described to me this way as a train. You have a three-car train. You have the engine, you have the middle car, and then you have the caboose. And that engine should be fact. That should be what's driving the train. That middle car of the train should be faith and what you believe in, what you believe to be true is. And then the caboose, the thing bringing up the rear of the train, is your feeling. Now, I probably have people that disagree with me. I truly believe that we should not be led by our feelings. I'm not here to say that. But what this analogy does to people like me, and in my context, it's a minimizing of your feelings because you preach so heavily that you should not be led by your feelings. I mean, it's the last thing on that train. So what that communicates is like, let's minimize it. In fact, like, what do you even do with your feelings? Because we're taught that if you pray more and read your Bible more, that is the answer to all questions. I've heard that preached from the stage, and that is just bad teaching because it created something in me that, not only was I feeling like, okay, the problem's me, but now I start dealing with anxiety and depression, and I don't know what to do with that because when I'm honest about that and even go on medication for that, that even creates, oh my goodness, like Curtis is on medication. Whew, I don't know if he should be working here because that's not good. It's this minimization of what you're feeling because it's the answer is, well, don't be led by your feelings. So just, those are just feelings. Like, let's look at what the fact actually is. But in the moment of fight or flight, you cannot think logically. Our brains are not wired for that in that moment. And I'm not no brain expert, or I don't have a master's degree or a doctorate in psychology, but I have enough experience and I've seen my share of counselors to know that that's how our brains work. And it's just bad teaching. It's abusive relationships and abusive teaching that minimizes your feelings and says, well, let's really look at what the fact is. It's just poor. Just poor. Indicator number 4. This lack, I probably should call it a lack of integrity, but really how I define it, it's this refusal to admit when someone is wrong. I think you heard me say in the context of this whole story was there was definitely things that I did not handle well and I did not do correctly. Things that I burned some bridges and I was like, man, am I going to be able to repair these relationships? But thanks be to God, and I'm thankful that I had enough awareness and enough counsel in my life to realize, Curtis, that's not right. Lay down your pride and you go make that right. Because that is a humbling thing to do, to go to somebody that you did wrong and admit, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I should not have done that. I should not have said that. Will you forgive me? So the point of this point number 4, or this indicator number 4, though, that could be an indication that you are in a spiritually abusive relationship, is this becomes one-sided. I was in one of these meetings. Again, the lead pastor and I viewed it as a marriage on the rocks. And I wanted to do everything I could to work on that relationship, repair that relationship. And so I remember one specific meeting. I had called our counselor, the guy that was counseling me. I had a lot of respect for him, and he had a lot of clout in our church. He had mentored and worked with a lot of our staff. So I brought him into this meeting between the lead pastor and myself, and I just said, I wanna try to work on this. These are the things that I'm sensing, that I'm feeling, um, and I'm learning to try to tell the full story and not come to these assumptions and conclusions by on things that I observe or don't observe. Okay, so I'm learning this, but let's have the conversation. Like, when you do this or when you say this, this leads to me thinking this, but I need to hear from you. What is the truth in this? So that's the point of this conversation. But in that meeting, it was one of the coldest meetings I'd ever been in. You could tell the lead pastor was super agitated that he was even at that meeting. And what came out of that meeting was the counselor saying, you know what? I think I have something that can help Curtis. I'm going to take him through this cognitive distortion therapy, I think is what he called it. And I think that we can really work on some of these things that are bogging him down mentally. Lead pastor said, you know what? Sounds like a plan. Um, I don't, he said something to the fact of, I don't know if this will really work, but that doesn't hurt to try that. Why don't you try that? Not once was there ever an admittance or an acknowledgement that there was anything that he needed to work on. So this is where it became one-sided, and it was this failing to admit that they had anything to work on. And that was another indicator that I realized later that this is not healthy. This is not right. The last indicator that you could be in a spiritually abusive relationship is what I like to call avoidance. People can be quick to move on. And leading up to those last few months, and again, I'm going to own my side of the story. There was times that I kind of avoided the lead pastor because the relationship had gotten really weird and awkward. And sometimes you don't know how to deal with it, even in spite of me taking some of those steps to work on it, when it was always met with, okay, you work on you and we'll see what that does. That led to some discouragement. And sometimes it led to me like not knowing how to really even socialize with that person, how to even be in the same room with that person. And so there was some avoidance on my part, but it was reciprocated for sure. There was a noticeable pulling back. I remember certain things, conversations that fell within my lane of ministry that I was no longer privy to. I was no longer a part of those conversations. Decisions were made without even talking to me. And again, that's not an arrogance, but it was things that, okay, well, they used to bring me up to speed on that because that's in my lane of ministry. But now I'm hearing about it after the fact. So all these things communicated something to me like, your voice is not valued here, um, and really not wanted. And that does some damage because when that's from the top of the organization, other people draft off that and they don't know how to act around you either. The last few weeks of my time there was a living hell. Like, it was so uncomfortable to even come into the church, to go into my office, to let alone sit in staff meetings. People kind of like didn't know what to say to you, so they stopped speaking to you, and that communicates something. But my hope in this is, if you're like me in any way, I was blinded to a lot of that in the moment. I was living in fight or flight. I could not take a step back and think cognitively and and get the full picture. I was so entrenched in what was going on that I didn't even realize how abusive the relationship was. Keep in mind too that in the midst of all this, God was not releasing me to leave. So I felt like I still had work to be done. I still had things to accomplish, influence. I still felt like I had influence with the people of the church. I didn't have any influence within the leadership of the church, but I still felt like I had influence with some of the people that I was pastoring. And so that made it extra weird, because at the end of the day, God was saying one thing and the leadership of the church was hearing something different from the Lord, apparently. And they had to make the decision for me, say, your time is done, but we want to send you out. We want to bless you out. So again, I hope this is helpful to you. This is not meant to be divisive in any way, but I think we got to do a better job of talking about this within the church, because you're starting to see fallout after fallout of people that were in abusive relationships, and that is not of the Lord. That creates a lot of damage. It's created a lot of therapy. So at least counselors and therapists, they're set because of that. And I don't make light of that, because we need counselors and therapists. We need those professionals that can hold our story in a way that the people that we thought had our back would be able to hold our story, but they didn't. And so I echo what I said earlier. If this has happened to you, I want to apologize. And I pray and I trust that you can seek healing from the Lord and be curious about your story and guard your heart, because that's the big one. Bitterness will creep in, and it's okay to be angry. It's okay to shake our fists up to the heavens and ask, why did you allow this to happen? It's okay, because we're human. But allow the Good Shepherd to hold your story. Surround yourself with people who are safe. You know, the last thing I will share, I was devastated from that time. And I was left reeling early 2021. Now what, Lord? Where am I supposed to go now? What am I to do now? And I was praying about my next step. And there was 3 churches I was praying about in the local Kansas City area. And honestly, the last choice, in my opinion, was the one God led me to, 2 or More Church. But here's what I've learned. 2 or More has been a place of safety and security, not in every area, but emotionally and spiritually. And that is what I've needed the most over these last 3 years, is to be in rooms with people that I can share my concerns and my frustrations in ways that I did in the past, where that kind of would ostracize me. Now, in this safe relationships, these people don't leave me. They hold my story, and they're there to love me unconditionally. And really, that's a reflection of the Father, isn't it? Surround yourself with people who are safe and who will hold your story and not leave you no matter what. That is the key. And that is a critical way to healing from these abusive spiritual relationships. So God bless you guys. And I pray for healing in your life. I'll see you on the next episode.